I'm Scott, as you probably know by now as I introed. But yeah, I'm an apps developer, Android apps developer by day, but I sort of have a special interest in app security, specifically Android security, and that's kind of what led me to sort of do this talk. And I tend to do talks around this kind of area. Much as like the last few releases of Android, there's been a sort of focus on security. I think Q more so. There's like the biggest proportion of like the new stuff and more breaking changes has been related to security and privacy, which is, you know, I think good, and there's certainly more for me to talk about. But like from a updatability point of view, it's really kind of like building on sort of Project Treble. For those familiar, Project Treble was something in the last version of Android which really dealt with the kind of segregation and sort of strong interfaces within Android as a platform between like vendor-specific code and system code. The idea being that you can apply updates a lot quicker, so OEMs can get the new versions of Android, new security updates, and not have to run through as much testing. So it eases their burden, and it gets us users updates quicker. And the real testament to the success of this is, say, with Android P, there was like 8 devices available. 8 devices had the preview version that was available, so you could put the beta on, from 7 manufacturers. With Android Q, that jumped to 23 devices and 13 manufacturers. So you can see it's kind of going in the right direction. But the fact that those manufacturers were able to make it available for the Q previews and the betas, means it's working. And Project Mainline is a kind of like Treble, like version 2. They're going like they're segregating more stuff to allow you to update system components independently of a sort of full system update. The first thing they're targeting for this is the media framework. For those who remember a few years ago, stage fright, a particular nasty vulnerability and exploit which was around the media framework. They've done tons of hardening and stuff in the platform around that. But now with Project Mainline, the idea is to sort of make that a completely separate updatable component, which should be updatable via the Play Store, via Google Play Services. So you don't need to get a full like system update to get an update of that. So if there's a patch, a security patch, it can be applied a lot quicker. And that's the key thing here. When we're saying updatability, we're not talking about getting all those old devices onto Android Q or the next version of Android. We're talking about getting that monthly security patch delivered, and that's been a major difference between the two leading mobile platforms, and this is like a big effort, a big part of that. So I think this is like a huge step forward to where we were, say, 3 years ago. In terms of like platform hardening, there's tons of cool stuff if you're into that, but it's really not that useful in a sort of quick talk environment. So I just point you to this really good article on the Android developers blog to sort of read more detail. There's some really interesting stuff how they've sort of separated sort of hardware and software codecs, and how they've done a bunch of enhanced sort of memory sanitizers and stuff like that. So it's interesting if you're into that kind of thing. But yeah, there to read more detail. The real the chunk of this talk, this short talk, is on the privacy changes. And I'll sort of cover the key things around which will be kind of like breaking changes or things you need to consider. So if you're using location in your app, you may want to pay attention, as there's some major changes. And it's not so bad if you're accessing it in the foreground only. If you're just accessing the foreground, there's not much changes. It's a runtime permission still. You still need to code defensively. You need to check if you've got that permission, because it can be disabled at any time. And if you need to access that permission, if you need to access location, say after the users hit the home button or the device is off, you're probably going to need a foreground service. So stuff like Strava or Runkeeper, kind of typical examples of an application which you'd expect to have a foreground service. It's tracking your location on a run. It's in the user's face, they know about it. And that's kind of part of these changes. It's all about giving the user a bit more awareness about what's going on, what's tracking their location, what services are running. And if you've been keeping up with the updates in Android and background tasks, you'll see that is a common trend. So the other thing just to highlight is that if you are using a foreground service, then in Android P, there's a separate permission around that, and there's only certain types of like foreground service types. Location is one of those. But so if you're going to use a foreground service, then you'll need to request the permission and define it like that. So that's just something to bear in mind. If you're accessing it in the background, that's where the sort of the major changes here in Q. There's a tri-state background, tri-state permission to allow all the time, which is the sort of what we used to have. Allow it only while the app is in use, and then of course deny. And there's a new permission around this called access background location. So this is something you'll need to define if you're targeting Q. If you're not targeting Q and your device that the app's running on is upgraded to Q, you'll be automatically granted that permission. But as soon as you target Q, you need to define that. And there's a bunch of scenarios around like what happens when the device upgrades to Q and you're running on there and you haven't sort of changed that. So definitely recommend going to the device location in the privacy section of the preview docs, because it kind of talks about all the different cases. The other thing to note is that the user will, it says they might receive a notification just to remind them that they've given access to your app to access in the background, and from that notification they can instantly deny access to the location. So it's the same thing. If you have to like gracefully degrade, you have to code defensively, and if your app is one that needs location in the background, then they sort of say use like geofences if you can. But if you're an app if you're doing some kind of background monitoring that you don't want the users to know about, this is going to be a big headache for you, and I think rightfully so as a user. That makes sense. Like I don't mind an app like Strava tracking my location because I know I'm going on a run. I want it to do that. I don't particularly want an app that's pre-installed from the network to do that. And so this kind of change helps limit that. But yeah, definitely check out more information at that link. The other changes around the external storage, and this is I think a good thing, because sort of the external storage has been a bit like the Wild West. Once you had, before runtime permission, you could just declare your permissions, and once you had that read-write external storage, you could read and overwrite other apps' files. It was no big deal. You could, I remember doing a security talk and talking about how if you read anything off the SD card, you must treat it as you must validate that before you start. Even if you wrote it, you must validate that it's, because you don't know who's changed it. There's no guarantees on it. These changes are trying to sort of circumvent that. So not circumvent that, trying to correct that issue. So they're doing us like summary chart. So they're locking it down, but also they're allowing stuff access where you don't actually need permissions. And there's some APIs that already exist which you may not know about. So if you need to access, you need to store like large files. Maybe you're a game and you need to unpack. I'll show my naivety about games programming, like textures, sprites, I don't know. But some big files that you need to, that it wouldn't be appropriate in your app's private directory, and you want to make use of the external files directory. You don't need any permissions for that. You can call get external files directory, which will give you a file path to somewhere on the external directory that you can just write to, and that's just your area. You don't have the same privacy protections as you would do on your app's private directory, but it's you have more space there, and those files will get automatically cleared up for you. If you want to just dump stuff in the media store, this is where things are changing. If you want to put stuff in the media store, so like photos, videos, and audio, you don't actually need permission to do that anymore. You can write that in, as long as you only need read external storage when you're accessing files from other apps. This is a big change. So if you're only rewriting your own files, it's cool. You don't have, there's less work to do. It's more things like if you're a media player app, you've got some extra work here. But if you're just accessing your own files, maybe you're a voice recorder app and it's just specific to your app and you don't want to share them, then there's less permissions, less restrictions here. The other things, if you were accessing like downloads, there's no direct access to these anymore. You need to use a storage access framework. And for those who haven't used it before, it's really simple. It's just like you fire off an intent effectively, and you use a system file picker to do that, and you get a URI back to that file, and you get temporary permission to access that file. So it's changed quite a bit, and it kind of this sort of change here is called scope storage, and you get like a filtered view on the external storage. So yeah, so the key thing here is if you need to access apps from other files, you're going to need to request that permission, and you have to access it via the media store. But you probably don't need to do this in most cases. You could probably just use a storage access framework. If you need to pick an image for a profile photo upload, just use a storage access framework. It's like 2 lines of code and then a callback. Because this is such like a big change, for some apps this will be huge. There's a bit of a band-aid where you can just opt out. And so you can just request this in your app. This is in your manifest file, and you can just opt out of it. It's not really rendered very well there, but I think you can get the gist. It's a flag to opt out. What Google is saying is, actually the other thing I should have said is that it's actually changed. They've changed the way they've done this between the beta 2 and beta 4. They've tweaked this, so they're still getting feedback, so it might change again before the release. But what Google is saying is this will be required in the next version of Android. So this is a temporary band-aid, but if you're running on the next version of Android, regardless of your SDK target level, you will need to support this. So yeah, it's a sort of warning for a year's time maybe. And there's tons more. I'll just cover like the 4 things that came to my mind that may affect you depending on the app you're doing. If you ever start an activity from a background service or anything, that's completely blocked now. You can't do that. The way to do this properly is to send a notification to the user. The user then presses that notification if they want to launch, if they want to interact with your app, and then you get permission to launch effectively. And this is like, as I said, this is kind of like the theme. Getting the user more involved. They have to opt into that. And of course, if it's a notification, like Andy kind of showed, you can easily disable notifications from apps. Notifications have changed a lot over the last couple of versions, but they've made it easier and easier to disable all notifications from apps. So you have to be very careful, how proactive you are. Proactive is the wrong word. The thing that apps do to get more engagement, you have to be really careful at that, because it's very easy just to block all notifications. There's a bunch of new restrictions on accessing hardware, sort of non-resettable IDs, like the device serial or the IMEI number. There's a new permission around this. They've sort of changed it. It used to be like read phone state. It's now read privileged phone state. So harder to get hold of. And so yeah, this is again a common theme between the last couple of versions of Android. It used to be anyone could get hold of this. Now it's getting more and more restricted. I'm sure that'll go completely, and regular apps won't have access to those. It'll just be something that's like an advertising ID or something that'll be resettable. So if you're using that, it's important that you may not be using it, but your analytics library or ad library may be using that. Something to bear that in mind. You might need to update those accordingly. The clipboard. This is like another one of those Wild West things, because up until Android Q, any app can register for clipboard changes, and then do it once with that information and go and access the clipboard. So you can, if you installed a untrusted app, you could just listen for clipboard, and then just totally hoover up your whole clipboard and upload it to a server somewhere. Now in Q, you can, now that it limits the access to the foreground app, the app that's running effectively, and then the default input device, so like your keyboard. That's like a huge change, like subtle under the hood really, and probably a lot of apps, unless you're doing something dodge, probably that doesn't matter. But I thought it was worth pointing out as a nice change. And actually, Andy touched a bit on this system alert window with the new sort of bubbles thing. If it's completely removed, you can't use this permission at all on Android Go devices. If you're unfamiliar, Android Go is like is a sort of, it's still Android, but it's a more Google controlled version of Android. It's like more targeted at the emerging markets and lower end devices. So kind of Google kind of wanting to sort of, obviously they want to push into these markets and turn on the next billion users using Google services. So they created Android Go, optimized it for cheaper devices, and then also handle all the updates, or handle a lot more of the heavy lifting of the updates to get into these industries, into these countries, and so they have a lot more control on what they can do on those devices. So if your app is running on a Go device, which it may be, because you can get them over here, they're just not as prevalent as sort of normal devices. If you rely on that permission for anything, it's not going to work in Android Q. That's something to bear in mind. And just almost at the end, there's a new Android X security library. I'm particularly excited about this because it's nice to have like an official Google approved encryption library to use in Android. They started off small with just like an encrypted file and shared preferences. That's particularly nice for me because I have an open source library that does the same thing, and I can now drop that completely and not feel bad about it because it's now the official Google version. So that's good for me. But what they've done here, and I like this, is there's no like low security option with this. There's balanced, which gives you sensible defaults, strong encryption, good performance. Then you have like maximum security, which is like the device has to have a hardware-backed key store. The user has to be present for decryption to take place. So that's maximum security wouldn't be suitable for some background process, I don't know, that's running. It's only like when when the user's present, so when the device is unlocked. So I think that's really cool. That's in like sort of pre-alpha or alpha at the moment, but that's really exciting. And just literally lastly, if there's just one thing you take away as an Android developer, or just as someone who is in a team of other developers, is the privacy checklist. And it's really just like a table like this, and it goes over some of the stuff I've talked about tonight, but it talks about like the key change, how your app is affected, the mitigation strategy, and how to sort of enable it or disable it. You can take it either way. But this is the key thing, to go to this, check out, you folks know your own apps, go through and look at what permissions and stuff you use and see if any of these, you get any ticks here effectively, because this is work you're going to need to do before Android Q becomes official and gets launched. So I definitely recommend checking that out. And that's it, no more puns, and yeah, thank you for listening.